What happened in that private meeting room last Tuesday changed everything. George Soros, the 94-year-old billionaire who has spent decades manipulating American politics from the shadows, thought he could intimidate Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett with threats and financial pressure. He screamed at her for 30 straight minutes, demanding she fall in line with his agenda. But when Crockett stood up and delivered her response, Soros went completely silent. What she said next not only shocked every billionaire in that room, but may have just saved American democracy itself. Before we dive into this incredible story, drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss these shocking political revelations that the mainstream media won't tell you about. The meeting was supposed to be secret, hidden away in a luxury penthouse overlooking the city. Some of the most powerful people in America had gathered for what they called a democracy summit. But what happened behind those closed doors was anything but democratic. It was a billionaire's attempt to buy and control an elected representative of the American people. And for the first time in decades, one of them said no. To understand why this confrontation was so explosive, you need to know exactly who was in that room and what was at stake for America's future. Jasmine Crockett represents Texas's 30th congressional district, a seat she won by promising to fight for working families against the influence of big money in politics. At 43 years old, she's a former civil rights attorney who built her career defending ordinary Americans against powerful corporations. She grew up in a middle-class family in St. Louis, worked her way through law school, and has never forgotten where she came from. More importantly, she's never been afraid to take on the establishment when they try to silence the voice of the people. On the other side of that room sat George Soros, the Hungarian-American billionaire, whose net worth exceeds $25 billion. For over 3 decades, Soros has used his massive fortune to influence elections, fund radical prosecutors, and push his vision of what America should become. Through his network of foundations and political action committees, he has spent over $32 billion trying to reshape American society. He doesn't just donate money to candidates. He expects complete loyalty in return. But Soros wasn't alone that day. The room was filled with other mega donors, tech billionaires, and hedge fund managers who had collectively spent hundreds of millions of dollars on the recent elections. They had a simple message for Crockett: play ball with their agenda or face the consequences. The stakes couldn't have been higher. These weren't just wealthy people making suggestions. They were demanding that an elected representative abandon her promises to the voters who sent her to Congress. They wanted her to support legislation that would benefit their businesses, oppose regulations that would limit their power, and stay silent about their influence on American politics. What they didn't expect was that Jasmine Crockett had come to that meeting with her own agenda, and she was about to turn their entire world upside down. The meeting started quietly enough. Soros, dressed in his signature dark suit, sat at the head of a polished mahogany table, surrounded by some of the wealthiest people in America. The penthouse windows offered a stunning view of the city below, but the atmosphere inside was tense and businesslike. Crockett had been invited under the pretense of a policy discussion about criminal justice reform. As a former civil rights attorney, she had legitimate expertise in the area, but within minutes it became clear this wasn't about policy at all. It was about control. The first warning sign came when Soros began speaking. His voice was soft but commanding as he outlined what he called mutual interest between Crockett's district and his organizations. He mentioned the millions of dollars his foundations had spent on voter registration drives in Texas. He talked about the prosecutors he had helped elect across the country, and then he got to the point. Congresswoman Crockett, Soros said, his Hungarian accent still noticeable after all these years in America. We have invested heavily in changing the direction of this country. Your election was part of that investment. Now it's time for you to deliver on our expectations. Crockett sat quietly, her hands folded on the table as Soros continued. He outlined a specific legislative agenda he wanted her to support: bills that would limit local law enforcement, regulations that would benefit his financial investments, immigration policies that aligned with his vision for America's future. We're not asking for your opinion, said another billionaire at the table, a tech mogul whose social media platforms had been accused of censoring conservative voices. We're telling you what needs to happen. You vote the way we need you to vote, and everyone benefits. You don't. And well, he let the thread hang in the air. That's when Crockett spoke up, for the first time. "Excuse me," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I think there's been some confusion about why I'm here. I came to discuss policy that helps the people of my district. I didn't come to take orders from anyone." The room fell silent. These were people accustomed to getting their way through financial pressure and political influence. They weren't used to being challenged, especially not by someone they considered beneath them in the power structure. Soros leaned forward, his eyes narrowing. "Congresswoman, I don't think you understand the situation you're in. We have the power to make or break political careers. We can fund primary challengers who will be more cooperative. We can direct resources away from your district. We can make your life very difficult." Another billionaire joined in, his voice dripping with condescension. "Do you have any idea how much money we've spent getting people like you elected? You owe us. This isn't a democracy where you get to vote your conscience. This is business." Crockett felt her jaw tighten. These men were openly admitting they had bought and paid for elected officials like she was some kind of employee. They were treating the United States Congress like their personal board of directors. "Let me get this straight," Crockett said, her voice rising slightly. "You're telling me that because you spent money on elections, you now own the representatives who won those elections. You think you can just order me around like I work for you?" The tension in the room was electric. Several of the billionaires exchanged glances, clearly surprised that their usual intimidation tactics weren't working. That's when Soros lost his temper completely. He slammed his hand on the table, his face flushing red with anger. "You ungrateful little nobody," he screamed, his composure completely shattered. "Do you have any idea who you're talking to? I have toppled governments. I have crashed currencies. I have made and destroyed more political careers than you can imagine." His voice echoed off the penthouse walls as he continued his tirade. "You are nothing. A small-town lawyer who got lucky and won election. I could end your career with a single phone call. I could make sure you never win another election as long as you live." The transformation in Soros was shocking to witness. The man who had carefully cultivated a public image as a thoughtful philanthropist and democracy advocate had completely dropped his mask. His face was contorted with rage, spittle flying from his mouth as he screamed. The other billionaires in the room had never seen him lose control like this, and several looked genuinely alarmed at what they were witnessing. "You think you understand power?" Soros continued, his voice now hoarser, but still filled with venom. "I have crashed the British pound. I made $1 billion in a single day betting against currencies. I have funded revolutions and toppled prime ministers. Governments consult me before making major decisions. And you insignificant little nobody, think you can stand against me?" He was pacing now, his hands shaking with fury, pointing accusingly at Crockett with each word. The carefully controlled demeanor that had made him feared in financial circles around the world had completely evaporated, replaced by the raw arrogance of someone who had never been told no by anyone who mattered. "I own district attorneys in dozens of cities. I have prosecutors who will indict or ignore cases based on my recommendations. I control immigration policy through the judges I've helped select. I shape education through the school boards I fund. And you think your little vote in Congress matters compared to that?" The tech billionaire shifted nervously in his seat, realizing that Soros was revealing far more than he should in front of anyone, let alone someone who might be recording. But Soros was beyond caring about strategy or discretion now. His legendary self-control had snapped completely. "You will vote the way we tell you to vote," Soros continued screaming, his accent becoming more pronounced as his anger escalated. "You will support our agenda. You will remember who really runs this country. It's not the voters, you naive fool. It's us. We decide what happens in America. We choose which laws pass. We determine which politicians succeed and which ones disappear into obscurity." He slammed his fist on the table again, causing several water glasses to tip over. The sound echoed through the penthouse like a gunshot. "You are nothing but a servant, a puppet, and you will dance when we pull your strings or we will cut them and watch you fall." The hedge fund manager at the far end of the table finally found his voice. "George, maybe you should shut up." Soros snapped, whirling around to face him. "This little girl needs to understand exactly how powerless she is. She needs to learn that democracy is a fairy tale. We tell the masses while we make the real decisions." The room fell dead silent. Everyone was staring at Crockett, waiting to see how she would respond to this verbal assault from one of the most powerful men in the world. Crockett sat quietly for a moment, letting Soros's words hang in the air. Her heart was pounding, but her face remained calm. She had dealt with bullies before in courtrooms, in corporate boardrooms, in city council meetings, but she had never encountered someone who so openly displayed their contempt for American democracy. Then slowly she stood up. Jasmine Crockett rose from her chair with the quiet dignity that had made her a respected civil rights attorney long before she ever ran for Congress. The room was so silent, you could hear the air conditioning humming in the background. Soros was still standing, his face red with anger, clearly expecting an apology or submission. Instead, Crockett looked directly into his eyes and began to speak. "Mr. Soros," she said, her voice steady and clear, "thank you for finally showing your true face. For years, people have wondered what happens behind closed doors when billionaires meet with elected officials. Now I know, and soon so will the American people." Soros' expression shifted from anger to confusion. "What are you talking about?" he demanded. Crockett reached into her jacket pocket and pulled out a small recording device. "I'm talking about this," she said, holding it up for everyone to see. "I'm talking about the fact that I've recorded every single word you just said, every threat, every admission, every moment where you revealed that you think you own the United States Congress." The room erupted in chaos. Several billionaires jumped to their feet, shouting over each other. The tech mogul who had made the initial threats was frantically reaching for his phone. Another was demanding that Crockett hand over the recording. But Soros went completely pale. For the first time in the meeting, he looked genuinely frightened. "That's illegal," shouted one of the hedge fund managers. "Recording without consent is a crime." Crockett smiled for the first time since entering the room. "Actually, it's not. This state has one-party consent laws for recordings. And as an attorney, I know exactly what's legal and what isn't. But I appreciate you revealing that you're not just corrupt, you're also ignorant of the law you're trying to manipulate." She began walking toward the door, but she wasn't finished talking. "You want to know what I learned in law school? Mr. Soros, I learned that when someone commits a crime, you gather evidence. When someone threatens a public official, you document it. When someone tries to buy and sell democracy like it's a commodity, you expose them." Soros found his voice again, but the commanding tone was gone. "You can't do this," he said, his voice almost pleading. "Do you understand what you're risking? The consequences of going against us?" Crockett turned back to face him. "I understand exactly what I'm risking. I'm risking the disapproval of a group of billionaires who think they can buy and sell American democracy. I'm risking the anger of people who believe that money gives them the right to control elected officials. I'm risking the wrath of individuals who have forgotten that, in America, power comes from the people, not from bank accounts." She paused, letting her words sink in. "And you know what? I'm willing to take that risk, because that's what patriots do." The word patriots hit the room like a thunderbolt. These were people who had spent decades wrapping their political agenda in the language of progress and social justice. They weren't used to having their patriotism questioned by someone they had tried to buy. "You think you're a patriot?" sneered the tech billionaire. "You're going to destroy everything we've built." "Good," Crockett replied without hesitation. "If what you've built requires corrupting elected officials and buying votes in Congress, then it deserves to be destroyed. The founders of this country fought a revolution against people exactly like you, wealthy elites who thought they had the right to control government without the consent of the governed." Soros was gripping the back of his chair, his knuckles white. "You have no idea what you're unleashing," he said. "The forces you're playing with are beyond your comprehension." Crockett walked back to the table and looked directly at each billionaire in turn. "Let me tell you what I'm unleashing, Mr. Soros. I'm unleashing the truth. I'm unleashing transparency. I'm unleashing the revolutionary idea that in America, elected officials should represent the people who vote for them, not the billionaires who try to buy them." She held up the recording device again. "This little device contains the most honest conversation about American politics that has happened in decades. It contains your admission that you believe you own members of Congress. It contains your threats against a sitting representative. It contains your confession that you think money trumps democracy." The room was so quiet now that everyone could hear Soros's labored breathing. The man who had toppled currencies and influenced elections around the world was facing something he had never encountered before. Someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or intimidated. And here's what's going to happen next, Crockett continued. I'm going to walk out of this room. I'm going to go back to Washington and I'm going to do the job the people of Texas sent me to do. Represent their interests, not yours. She moved toward the door again, but paused for one final statement. Oh, and Mr. Soros, when you said I was nothing but a servant, you were absolutely right. I am a servant. But I serve the American people, not billionaire puppet masters. I serve the Constitution, not your bank account. I serve democracy, not your oligarchy. She opened the door and looked back one last time. And if you think that makes me small or powerless, you're about to learn just how much power the truth can have in the hands of someone who isn't afraid to use it. As Crockett walked out, she could hear the eruption of angry voices behind her. Soros was shouting orders to his assistants. The tech billionaire was making frantic phone calls. The hedge fund managers were discussing damage control. But it was too late. The truth was out, and it was in the hands of someone who understood exactly what to do with it. 2 hours later, Crockett was back in her congressional office, uploading the recording to a secure server and preparing the most important speech of her political career. But she wasn't working alone. Word of what had happened in the penthouse had somehow leaked, and her office was buzzing with activity. Constitutional law experts had volunteered their services to ensure the recording's legal admissibility. Cybersecurity specialists were helping protect her digital files from the inevitable hacking attempts that would come from Soros's network of allies. Former FBI agents now working as private investigators were offering to help verify the authenticity of the recording and protect it from tampering. More importantly, other members of Congress were quietly reaching out to share their own experiences with billionaire pressure campaigns. Senator Patricia Williams from Michigan called to describe a similar meeting she had attended 6 months earlier where tech billionaires had demanded she vote against internet privacy legislation. Representative Carlos Martinez from California shared a story about real estate moguls who had threatened to destroy his district's economy if he didn't support their development projects. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle. That was the shadow system controlling American politics. These weren't isolated incidents or random examples of wealthy individuals trying to influence policy. They were parts of a coordinated, systematic effort to transform American democracy into a plutocracy where elected officials served at the pleasure of their financial backers rather than their voters. Crockett realized she was sitting on more than just evidence of one corrupt meeting. She was holding the key to exposing an entire network of corruption that stretched across multiple states involving dozens of elected officials and representing billions of dollars in illegitimate influence. As she prepared for the press conference that would change everything, Crockett reflected on the irony of the situation. Soros and his allies had invited her to that meeting, believing they could add another politician to their collection of purchased representatives. Instead, they had handed her the evidence she needed to begin dismantling their entire system of corruption. The next morning would bring chaos, legal battles, and political upheaval that would reshape American democracy. But tonight, in her office, surrounded by allies and evidence, Jasmine Crockett felt something she hadn't experienced since entering politics: hope that the system could actually be fixed. The earthquake that followed Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with George Soros and his billionaire allies didn't take long to register across the American political landscape. Within 24 hours of her return to Washington, Crockett had done something unprecedented in modern politics. She had completely exposed the shadow system that had controlled American democracy for decades. The first shockwave came when Crockett called a press conference the next morning. Standing behind a podium in the Capitol building with the American flag prominently displayed behind her, she made an announcement that sent tremors through the political establishment. Yesterday, I was invited to what I was told would be a policy discussion, she began, her voice calm but determined. Instead, I found myself in a room with some of the wealthiest people in America, who informed me that they expected to control my votes in Congress because they had spent money on elections. The assembled reporters leaned forward, sensing they were about to witness something historic. What I experienced was not lobbying. It was not political discussion. It was a direct attempt to purchase a member of Congress like a commodity, and I have the recording to prove it. The press room erupted in chaos. Reporters were shouting questions, cameras were flashing, and somewhere in New York, George Soros was watching his carefully constructed public image crumble in real time. But Crockett wasn't finished. She played selected excerpts from the recording, carefully edited to protect herself legally, while exposing the most damaging admissions. Soros's voice filled the room as he screamed about toppling governments and owning elected officials. The tech billionaire's threats about making her life difficult. The hedge fund manager's casual admission that they considered members of Congress to be employees they had purchased. Within hours, the story had exploded across social media. The hashtags exposed was trending nationwide, with millions of Americans sharing the clips and demanding investigation. Conservative commentators called it the smoking gun that proved their long-standing accusations about billionaire influence. Liberal politicians found themselves in the impossible position of defending the indefensible or breaking ranks with their major donor. The response from Soros and his allies was swift and predictable. Within hours of the press conference, a team of high-powered attorneys had filed a lawsuit claiming the recording was illegal and demanding its suppression. Soros himself issued a statement through his foundation, calling Crockett's actions a dangerous attack on private political discourse and claiming his words had been taken out of context. But the damage was already done. The American people had heard, in his own words, what George Soros really thought about their democracy. They had listened to him scream about owning members of Congress. They had witnessed his complete contempt for the idea that elected officials should represent their constituents rather than their donors. The political fallout was immediate and severe. 3 Democratic members of Congress, who had received significant funding from Soros-linked organizations, issued statements distancing themselves from his comments. A Senate committee announced it would investigate foreign influence in American elections. The Attorney General's office opened a preliminary inquiry into potential violations of federal laws governing corruption and bribery. But perhaps the most significant response came from an unexpected source: other members of Congress, who had their own stories about pressure from mega donors. 2 days after Crockett's press conference, Representative Mike Johnson from Louisiana called his own press conference. "Congresswoman Crockett's courage has inspired me to tell my own story." He said, 6 months ago, I was invited to a similar meeting with tech billionaires who demanded I support legislation that would benefit their companies. When I refused, they threatened to fund my primary opponent within a week. A dozen members of Congress from both parties had come forward with similar stories. The picture that emerged was devastating. A systematic effort by the wealthiest Americans to purchase the loyalty of elected officials through a combination of campaign contributions and direct threats. The media coverage was unlike anything seen in modern American politics. Traditional news outlets found themselves forced to cover a story that exposed the very system of mega-donor influence they had long been part of. Conservative media hailed Crockett as a hero who had exposed the corruption of the establishment. Liberal outlets struggled to defend billionaire influence while maintaining their credibility with their audiences. International coverage was equally intense. News organizations around the world picked up the story as evidence of American political corruption. Democratic activists in other countries pointed to the recordings as proof that the United States had become an oligarchy, disguised as a democracy. The impact on Soros personally was devastating. For decades, he had operated in the shadows, influencing elections and policy through a complex network of foundations and political action committees. His public image had been carefully managed by a team of public relations professionals who portrayed him as a philanthropist dedicated to democracy and human rights. But Crockett's recording had revealed the man behind the carefully crafted image. The world had heard him scream about toppling governments and owning politicians. They had listened to his complete contempt for the democratic process. The mask had been ripped away, and what was underneath was ugly. The financial consequences for Soros were immediate. Several universities announced they would no longer accept donations from his foundations. International human rights organizations distanced themselves from his funding. 3 countries opened investigations into his political activities within their borders. More importantly, his influence in American politics had been permanently damaged. Politicians who had once eagerly accepted his support now found themselves toxic to voters who had heard the recordings. The Soros name, once whispered respectfully in Democratic fundraising circles, had become political poison, but the most significant impact was on Jasmine Crockett herself. Overnight, she had become the most famous member of Congress in America. Her office was flooded with interview requests from news organizations around the world. Speaking invitations poured in from civic groups, universities, and political organizations across the country. More importantly, small dollar donations began flooding into her campaign coffers. Americans who had never heard of her before, the FI Soros confrontation, were sending $5, $10, and $25 with notes thanking her for standing up to billionaire corruption. Within 2 weeks, she had raised more money from individual donors than most members of Congress raise in an entire election cycle. The message was clear. The American people were hungry for politicians who couldn't be bought. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Crockett was invited to address a joint session of Congress, an honor usually reserved for foreign heads of state and presidents delivering their State of the Union address. The invitation came from the Speaker of the House, who said the American people deserved to hear directly from someone who had exposed the shadow system that has corrupted our democracy. Standing before her colleagues in the same chamber where presidents had declared war and announced peace treaties, Crockett delivered a speech that many observers compared to the great moments in congressional history. The atmosphere in the chamber was electric. Every seat was filled with members from both parties putting aside their usual partisan divisions to witness this historic moment. The gallery above was packed with citizens who had traveled from across the country, many wearing buttons reading "Democracy, not oligarchy," and "Representatives, not puppets." News cameras from around the world captured every moment as Crockett approached the podium. "For too long," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the hushed chamber, "we have allowed a small group of wealthy individuals to treat this institution like their personal board of directors. We have permitted billionaires to believe they can purchase the loyalty of elected officials like commodities in a marketplace. We have tolerated a system where money speaks louder than the voices of the American people." The response was immediate. Members of Congress began nodding in agreement, many thinking of their own experiences with donor pressure that they had never spoken about publicly. In the gallery, citizens wiped tears from their eyes as they heard someone finally articulate what they had suspected for years about their government. But Crockett was just getting started. "The recording I made in that penthouse reveals more than just the corruption of a few wealthy individuals. It exposes a systematic assault on the fundamental principles of American democracy. When George Soros screamed that he decides what happens in America, he wasn't boasting, he was confessing. When he admitted to controlling prosecutors and judges, he wasn't making threats, he was revealing the truth about how our justice system has been compromised." The chamber erupted in gasps and murmurs. Even members of Congress who had suspected such corruption were shocked to hear it confirmed so explicitly. The International Press Corps frantically took notes, realizing they were witnessing the exposure of one of the most significant political scandals in American history. But perhaps most revealing was what happened when I refused to be bought. Crockett continued. Their masks completely fell away. The philanthropist became a screaming tyrant. The democracy advocate revealed his contempt for democratic processes. The champion of social justice showed his true belief that justice is something that can be purchased by the highest bidder. By the highest bidder, she paused, scanning the faces of her colleagues, many of whom were visibly moved by her words. They made one critical error in their calculations. They assumed that because they had money, they had power. They forgot that in America, real power comes from the consent of the government, not the size of your bank account. She paused, looking directly at the members of Congress who had received funding from Soros-linked organizations. But that ends today. Today we recommit ourselves to the revolutionary idea that in America, power flows from the people to their representatives, not from bank accounts to purchase politicians. Today we remember that our oath is to the Constitution and the people we serve, not to the billionaires who try to buy us. The standing ovation lasted for nearly 5 minutes. Members from both parties rose to their feet, many with tears in their eyes as they applauded a speech that had reminded them why they had entered public service in the first place. But perhaps the most powerful moment came at the end of Crockett's speech, when she addressed the American people directly. To every billionaire who thinks they can buy our democracy, you are wrong. To every mega donor who believes money gives them the right to control elected officials, your time is over. To every oligarch who thinks they can treat America like their personal kingdom, we reject your authority. She held up a copy of the Constitution. This document doesn't guarantee the right of the wealthy to purchase politicians. It guarantees the right of the people to govern themselves through their elected representatives. And as long as there are patriots willing to defend it, that right will never be for sale. The response from billionaire donors was swift and vindictive. Within days, several Soros-allied organizations had announced they would be funding primary challenges against Crockett. In the next election, dark money groups began running attack ads, questioning her motives and her methods. Friendly media outlets published op-eds suggesting she had violated the privacy of legitimate political discourse. But their attacks only seemed to strengthen Crockett's position. Every negative ad generated more small-dollar donations to her campaign. Every attack piece resulted in more speaking invitations and interview requests. The billionaires who thought they could destroy her had instead made her into the most powerful voice for political reform in America. 6 months after the confrontation in that penthouse, the impact was still rippling through American politics. Congress had passed the most comprehensive campaign finance reform bill in decades, with explicit provisions preventing the kind of donor intimidation Crockett had exposed. The Supreme Court had agreed to hear a case challenging unlimited political spending by individuals and corporations. 3 states had passed laws requiring the disclosure of all political donations above $200. More importantly, a new generation of politicians had emerged. Inspired by Crockett's example, candidates across the country were running on platforms of rejecting big money influence and representing only their constituents. The phrase "Remember Crockett" had become a rallying cry for politicians who refused to be bought. George Soros, meanwhile, had largely retreated from public life. His political activities had been severely curtailed by legal challenges and public scrutiny. Several of his organizations had shut down or dramatically reduced their operations. The man who had once boasted about toppling governments had been brought down by a single recording in a congresswoman who refused to be intimidated. But perhaps the most lasting impact of the confrontation was what it revealed about the American people themselves. When given a clear choice between billionaire oligarchy and democratic representation, they had overwhelmingly chosen democracy. When forced to pick between bought politicians and independent representatives, they had chosen independence. The grassroots movement that emerged in the wake of Crockett's revelation was unlike anything seen in modern American politics. Town halls across the country began featuring Crockett questions, direct inquiries to representatives about whether they had ever been pressured by wealthy donors and how they had responded. Citizens organized democracy defense groups that monitored the voting records of their representatives against the interests of their major donors. Small businesses began displaying signs reading, "We support representatives who can't be bought," creating a new form of political expression that linked economic activity to democratic values. Churches, synagogues, mosques, and other religious institutions incorporated discussions about political corruption and moral courage into their regular programming, often citing Crockett's example as a model of standing up for principles against powerful opposition. The impact extended beyond politics into popular culture. Country music artists wrote songs about standing up to corrupt elites. Hollywood producers announced plans for movies based on Crockett's story. Authors published best-selling books analyzing the implications of the confrontation for American democracy. The phrase "remember who you serve" became a popular saying, appearing on everything from coffee mugs to bumper stickers. Educational institutions at every level began incorporating the story into their curricula. Elementary schools used simplified versions to teach children about courage and standing up to bullies. High schools analyzed the constitutional and legal implications. Universities offered entire courses on the intersection of wealth, power, and democratic governance, using the Soros-Crockett confrontation as a central case study. The international impact was equally significant. Democracy advocates in countries around the world pointed to Crockett's example as proof that ordinary citizens could still challenge entrenched power structures. Authoritarian regimes found themselves facing new questions about the role of wealthy elites in their own political systems. Democratic governments began implementing their own versions of transparency requirements for political meetings. Perhaps most importantly, the confrontation had sparked a broader conversation about the nature of democracy itself. Philosophers, political scientists, and ordinary citizens engaged in discussions about whether representative government could truly function when vast wealth inequality allowed a small number of individuals to exercise disproportionate influence over elected officials. The story of Jasmine Crockett's confrontation with George Soros had become more than just a political scandal. It had become a reminder of what America could be when its elected officials remembered who they really served. As Crockett said in her final interview about the incident, democracy isn't something that happens to us. It's something we choose every single day, every single vote, every single time we demand that our representatives serve us instead of their donors. The billionaires had us convinced that money was more powerful than truth, but truth, when it's spoken by someone who isn't afraid, turns out to be the most powerful force in politics after all. The recording that had started as evidence of corruption had become something much more significant. Proof that American democracy, though wounded by decades of billionaire influence, was far from dead. It just needed patriots willing to fight for it. And thanks to Jasmine Crockett's courage in that penthouse meeting, millions of Americans had been reminded that the fight was worth having. What do you think about Crockett's brave stand against billionaire corruption? Drop your thoughts in the comments below and make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you never miss these explosive political stories that the mainstream media tries to bury. Because when patriots stand up to corruption, the whole world needs to hear about it. The question now is, who will be the next representative to follow Crockett's example? And how many more secret recordings will it take before the American people finally take back their democracy from the billionaires who think they own it? But Crockett's impact went far beyond just exposing one billionaire's corruption. Her actions had sparked a nationwide movement that was fundamentally changing how Americans viewed their relationship with their elected representatives. Town halls across the country began featuring a new question that voters regularly asked their representatives. Have you ever been threatened or pressured by wealthy donors? And if so, what did you do about it? The Crockett Standard became a new benchmark for political integrity. Candidates running for office were now expected to pledge that they would record any meetings with mega donors and make those recordings public if any attempts at corruption occurred. Political action committees, formed specifically to support candidates who took this pledge, funded entirely by small-dollar donations from ordinary Americans. Universities began teaching Crockett's confrontation with Soros as a case study in political courage and democratic resistance. Law schools added courses on the ethics of recording political conversations and the legal frameworks for exposing corruption. Political science departments analyzed the incident as a turning point in the struggle between democratic representation and oligarchic control. International democracy advocates cited Crockett's example in their own countries, encouraging elected officials to expose attempts by wealthy individuals to purchase political influence. The phrase "pulling a Crockett" entered the global political vocabulary as shorthand for exposing corruption through strategic documentation and fearless truth-telling. Perhaps most significantly, the incident had inspired a new generation of young Americans to enter politics. Applications to law schools spiked as students cited Crockett's example as motivation for pursuing careers in public service. Campaign volunteer organizations reported unprecedented interest from college students who wanted to work for candidates who couldn't be bought. The billionaire class, meanwhile, had learned a harsh lesson about the risks of overplaying their hand. Private political meetings now routinely included legal advisors warning participants about recording laws and potential exposure. The era of casual threats and open corruption had ended, replaced by a new weariness about what might become public. Soros himself had become a cautionary tale within elite circles. Other megadonors distanced themselves from his methods, not out of moral concern but out of practical fear of being similarly exposed. The man who had once commanded respect and fear in equal measure had become an object lesson in the dangers of hubris. Stay tuned, because this story is far from over.